A few years ago, I realized that trying to find the best stories in cricket was impossible for any fan. I even tried to get funding to make my own cricket Huffington Post. It never quite worked. But luckily, we finally have someone filling this massive void in our game. Best of Cricket. They scour the publications everywhere to find, quite simply, all the best news and the greatest stories on our sport. Then they make it just as easy. They either email it or WhatsApp it direct to you. Cricket's greatest tales delivered to your device. This is truly the best of cricket. All right. Okay, recording started. You used StreamYard before? It records from your end. You know that.
Yep.
So if I go black or go weird, just keep talking. Great. Can I get your name and job title, please?
My name is Dan Liebke. My job title is I am the author of a new book called Australian Cricket's Best of the Best.
So I've been thinking about this a lot. So you've written a whole book about the Allan Border Medal. But I was thinking about the Allan Border Medal's place in sort of culture. Is it possible that the Allan Border Medal was essentially made up because cricketers wanted a night where they could dress up?
That's pretty much my understanding of it, yes. I think just the research I did on this tends to suggest that Shane Warne, when he was part of the head of the Cricketers Association, he very much liked the idea that because he didn't quite get to qualify for a Brownlow medal, he thought, well, I'll do the next best thing. I'll create my own medal that I might win. And then, of course, tragically, he never won it. But in theory, he could have won it. So, yeah. So,
well, I mean, he went to a lot of...
Shane Warne's idea.
He walked a lot... Yeah, he got to walk the red carpet, which is about 80% of what he was looking for there anyway. It should be noted, if you're in Australia, you will know this, but a lot of fans will be listening to this around the world, that Australia has a medal culture that is not particularly known around the world. So the Brownlow that you just talked about, that's the Aussie rules one, and that's huge. The Monday before the grand final was like, half the country would watch that. And then, and you're going to have to correct me on this, but I know that you're a fan of the other sport, but is it the Dally M medal?
It is the Dally M, yeah. And it's not quite as insanely followed as the Brownlow. The Brownlow is like next level. Brownlow's like, 10 out of 10. Dally M's like 2 out of 10. Allan Border Medal's like 0.2 out of 10. So
yeah,
I think
but
that's
the point being is, I would assume that Dally M and the Brownlow sort of come from that, whether one inspired the other, because a lot of stuff between AFL and Rugby League kind of inspire each other, even if they are completely separate. But the point being is, there is an element of, in Australian sport, we like to go to a big event, parade all of our athletes through the center of it, film it, make the event 18 hours longer than it needs to be. The Brownlow starts at dawn and finishes 4 days later, from what I can remember. Yes. I remember watching it with my wife once on a stream, and she was like, "How is this possibly still going on? Like, we've conceived a baby, we've had a baby, the second baby's on its way. We still don't know if Dusty is going to win this thing." Who's Dusty was her next question. But the point being is that already existed, and I don't think I'm going to have to do this one day, but the AFL's and Aussie rules football in general's power over cricket, or motivation over cricket, or inspiration over cricket is huge. Like, if you went through all the different things that exist in cricket because of Aussie rules football, it's really high up. So this is just and that's not just in Australia. That's like the IPL final system is taken from Aussie rules football, right? Like, there's so many different things that you have from this. It becomes the first one. I remember it starting, and there was a little bit of excitement. Then there was about 3 or 4 years where people took it quite seriously. Then there was a bit of a dip. It seems to me in a bit of a lull, the Allan Border Medal at the moment. Where's your feelings on it?
That's pretty much my feelings as well. I think part of the excitement of those first 2 years was that this was an Australian side that had won, like they crushed every opposition they could. There was nothing else to compete against, so they just started competing against one another. All right, we beat everybody, so who's the best out of us? And so that was the excitement in the first few years. And then after a while, I think it became, oh, wait a sec, we're not beating everybody anymore. I mean, there's a great moment, which I cover in the book, where after the 2005 Ashes loss, everybody got the shits because Phil Tufnell came on and made, a few pretty tame jokes about how bad the Australian cricket team was, and they were all fuming and upset about it. And, so I think at that point it was a little bit, okay, well, what exactly are we celebrating? And then by the time you get into kind of this, 2010-11 era, Poor old Watto's winning back-to-back ones, and no one cares because it's just like, well, you're not the best, you're the least rubbish of the lot. So, yeah.
There's been some moments. I've got this memory, and you might have written about it in the book, but I've got this memory of like Colin Miller and Michael Slater being absolutely hammered on a table together, which is one memory. Recent ones, of course, Mitch Marsh's incredible speech. What a gift to life Mitch Marsh is every time he opens his mouth. His incredible speech. What are some of the other sort of more non-crickety great moments of Allan Border Medal? I'm sure there's probably been some random things that have happened that I've forgotten about now.
Well, an interesting thing is Russell Crowe played at the first one with his band, 30-odd Foot of Grunt.
He did too! I forgot that.
so that's a good one. But yeah, there's a whole heap of weird things. Like HG and Roy did like a 10-minute spiel one time. So they came up and introduced, basically it was just a tribute to Allan Border and why he was awesome in the 80s when everyone else was shithouse. So yeah, it was there's been a whole heap of things like that, as you alluded to. Slater, I think it was the first one, maybe it was the second one, decided he'd clamber on stage while Jimmy Barnes was singing K-San, so he joined in with that. And lots of crazy antics of that kind. So I cover all those. I mean, they're not every year, so yeah, when they show up, I give a glimpse of the actual ceremony itself. Mostly the book's about the actual cricketing performances that led to someone getting a medal draped around their head.
But you did something far more interesting, which is actually what I want to talk about here, which is you went back and you looked at the historical Allan Border medalist. Did you go back to day dot?
I did. I went back to 1877. So right, as day dot as Test cricket gets.
Yes. My first question is, who has won the most Allan Border medals, according to you, Dan?
I'll give you a clue. His initials are DGB.
I thought he might have been. How many did you end up giving the great man? Is it more than 10?
I think he pretty much hogged. Well, he won in 1929, which was a surprise to me because I kind of felt, all right, he didn't burst out of the blocks, but apparently he did. He burst out enough to get the first one of the 20s. I basically broke down the historical ones by decades. So it was, player of the 20s, player of the 30s, player of the 40s, etc.
Oh, okay.
And I tallied how many they won in each one, and whoever won the most, I just declared them the winner of the decade and then wrote about them as my kind of entry for that particular decade. So Bradman, obviously player of the 30s. I think he won all, but maybe there were two where he didn't get it. He won the other 8.
Who pipped him? Like someone like Grimmett or O'Reilly might have got him?
I'm pretty sure it was O'Reilly. And I think it was Arthur Morris might have pipped him at the post in one year. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think he also won another one in the 40s as well. So he's all over the place.
Who are the other? Does Bannerman win the first one?
It's not Bannerman. The first one I combined. Well, I cheated a bit. I said, well, I'm not going to do a player of the 1870s. That's
there weren't a lot of them.
I did 1870s and 1880s. So it was Spofford, I think, who got the first one there.
Oh, that's fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I suppose with Bannerman as well, if you do the 1 year, he would probably win it. But he was absolutely rubbish outside of that one incredible innings. Like, he really becomes a terrible player. His brother, I think,
good test
was
to be
much
good
better.
in, though.
Yeah, if you're going to do something, it's that great story, isn't it? Bannerman plays one test where he does anything, and Ted Pooley is supposed to be the wicketkeeper for England and is in jail in New Zealand. Like, those two guys really had diverging lives based on what happened in that first test and how they were remembered. Okay, so we've got Spofford, we've got Bradman. Is there anyone else who dominated in a way that you didn't really expect, or was noticeable to you?
Mostly it was the kind of names, because I'm not as much of a historian as you are. I'm mostly just, in my lifetime, which is becoming more historical as I age. But in general, like the early 1900s, I'm not on top of that. I just know the big names. But it was pretty much all the big names came out, your Warwick Armstrongs and the like. So Victor Trumper, the usual ones back then. And because I didn't want to repeat anybody, Betty Wilson got a nod. So we covered the women as well. So that's a virtual Belinda Clarke award, of course. And then obviously by the time you get to the 70s, the 70s was a fascinating one because I had a rule that if players had the same number of wins in a decade, then I just chose whichever of the two players I found the cooler or more interesting to write about.
That makes
So
sense.
Lilly and Chappell were so even throughout the 70s. Greg Chappell, this is. And it was just like, oh, God, they're both pretty good. And I even thought, all right, am I going to break this tie by looking at World Series cricket? And I had a poke around at that. It's like, well, Chappell probably would have won the first year and Lilly the second, or maybe it was the other way around. I don't remember. But I looked at that. I was like, bloody hell, I can't even separate them there. And then it was just like, Lilly's cooler than Chappell. So, sorry, Craig. You're missing out here.
I mean, Greg Chappell is cool, but when compared to Dennis Lilly, it wouldn't feel as much, would it? Like, I think if Greg Chappell had played in the 60s, like, you know, he's Richie Benaud, right? Like, he's the guy that everyone would go on about. But by the 70s, there's a lot of chest hair and sideburns and, you know, raw masculinity and, you know, and everything. I've just been finishing a documentary series for Channel 9 on the Kerry World Series cricket, and it's like there's so much just ridiculous dripping energy, and Greg looks like your favorite high school teacher in it.
He's almost English in comparison to some of those other incredibly Australian men. Like they are hairy and moustachy and and he seems almost upper class. And part of that's the way he batted as well. Like that incredibly straight, an orthodox batting style.
All right, here's my other thing. I wanted to, I'm just seeing if I want to see if I wrote this question down. No, I didn't write this question down, but I did mean to. How many Allan Border medals would Allan Border have won? If Allan Border could win an Allan Border medal.
I think he was definitely the player of the 80s. I'll tell you that because there was not a lot of competition in the 80s.
Nope.
Although it was interesting. I was quite impressed that Steve Waugh would have won one in 89. He would have also won one in 95. And then, of course, he did win one in 2001. So that's pretty good from the old award.
3 decades.
3 decades. But yeah, AB, I think AB won a couple in the middle years where everybody else was absolutely hopeless. And then he might have also won one in the back end of the 80s, maybe 88. So yeah, I think he won 3 in the 80s in total, which felt actually less than I would have expected. But there you go.
Yeah, I mean, he was. I suppose there were probably little flare-up moments with other cricketers who would come through at times where, you know, Bruce Reid might have had a period, Craig McDermott might have had a period, David Boone might have even had a period.
I think David Boone was in there. I think even Simon O'Donnell was in there. So, and a good cross-check for my methodology was for the periods where it overlapped with, remember the Benson and Hedges International Cricketer of the Year?
Yes.
That was that was kind of a good cross-check. It's like, well, most of those games are in common with the games that were used to judge the Allan Border Medal. So I was just like, if they're broadly similar, that's to be expected. And Simon O'Donnell got a lot of points. Won Benson and Hedges International Cricketer of the Year summer, and he similarly got a lot of points in the Allan Border Medal that year. So, yeah.
What about Allan Border? That was something that you can't really write about the Allan Border Medal without writing about Allan Border. What do you think? I wonder if we were naming the medal now. I just don't think Allan Border, it would be named after him now in a way that it was in 2000. That was about 5 or 6 years after he retired, maybe 7 years after he retired. That was kind of the peak of, Allan Border was great. And then as the team gets really, really good and kind of surpasses everything that Allan Border did, it's interesting how much his legacy is diminished now.
Yeah. I guess so. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. But I guess at the time he was still like he would have still been the top test run scorer at the time. I think when in 2000, maybe Sachin had overtaken him by then, but he was certainly Australia's number one by then.
I don't think Sachin would have gone past him by then, would he?
No,
he would have been on his way.
He was still the number one test run scorer at the time. So, so he obviously had all these longevity stats to his name, which is always sound impressive. And, and of course, even without the longevity, like his actual stats, his batting average against the West Indies, for God's sake. He was obviously a great cricketer. But I think you're right. I think in the modern day, people kind of look back and go, oh, he was good in the 80s. Who else was good? Oh, yeah. The Wars were good in the 90s. Warney. It'd probably be Warren today, wouldn't it? Given everything that's happened.
Yeah, and also, I find it interesting that they sort of skipped some of the earlier greats as well. Like, it could have been, you could have had a Chappell medal, for instance. You know, Bradman is the obvious one, but I think you might have found this research. I think there was a specific reason they didn't name it after Bradman, and that was partly just because everything else in the history of mankind had been named after Bradman.
Everything's named after Bradman. Bradman, I think, had also been like the Young Cricketer of the Year award, like predating the Allan Border Medal. So I think they just didn't change that. They just said you can keep doing that. That will be the Bradman Award, because Bradman was young once, apparently.
They could have gone back to people like Warwick Armstrong as well, Victor Trumper. Like, you know, there were other things that they could have done. I think, and you kind of touched on it a moment ago there, I think people have forgotten how good a cricketer Allan Border was. Is that something that you kind of look at in the book?
Yeah, well, because I write a chapter on each player of the decade, it gave me a perfect opportunity to like kind of delve into, and obviously given the book's named after him, essentially. That was the chapter where I got deep into why exactly it was justified naming this award after him. He's just, you look at his record against the West Indies. There's one in series where it's basically just Border versus the West Indies, and he kind of holds them off for 3 tests in a row. He can't hold them off forever because they're the West Indies, but he holds them off longer than any one man should have been able to hold them off for. He's got like 98 not out and 100 not out in the same test. Like that's insane. So he was a great cricketer, and the fact that nobody else was there to help him for about 2 years. The way the Allan Border Medal works, as you know, is that you get 3-2-1 points for each match, and in one of the years in the 85 or 86, it was just like Border's just getting 3 points in every match. There is no one else doing anything, so he just races out to this impossible to catch lead, and it's just like, okay. Hopefully someone else shows up soon, and they did eventually. The story of Australian cricket in the 80s.
Definitely. You look at his record. So in the West Indies, he plays 10 tests and he averages 53, and he plays from 84 to 1991. So he plays against both generations of the West Indies bowlers. Yeah. And the other best lineup I would say he went up against was Pakistan, which he plays from 1980 until... when was his last test? 1988, I think, was the last time he went to Pakistan. He averages 62 in 9 tests. And he also plays against peak Hadley through the majority of his career. So those are the 3 best bowling attacks. He averages over 50 in those lineups, right? Yeah. Like it, when we went through it, you would know about this, but I don't know if everyone knows about this. Do you know about the Australia home and away averages in batting?
No, fill me in. I may know what you're talking about, but give me specifics.
So there are heaps of Australian batters with a batting average above 45, let's say, but certainly above 50 compared to other countries, right? And you start to go, oh, there's so many great batters. And you go through them. Like, well, he averages 38 away from home, and he averages 35 away from home, and he averages 32. I think Warner might be 32 or 33 or something.
Warner's rubbish away from home.
But Michael Clarke is another one. Doug Walters there's a lot of them. When you go, and I'm not talking, we're talking about the ones you remember. I could go back through history and you keep seeing this pattern, right? Yeah. Bradman is one of the rare ones who made more runs away from home than he did at home. So Australian batters on Australian pitches are probably the best batters who have ever existed, right? Australian batters away doesn't always carry over. Would you like Border's record? So Border, he averages 46 in Australia, which you would take is absolutely fine. Border, when traveling, averages 56.57.
Yeah. That's Sangakkara-esque?
I mean, and as we just said, the 3 best bowling attacks he went up against, he absolutely crushed them over there. There's no massive holes within his away record. He played 3 tests in South Africa. At that stage, he was like 183 years old.
Yeah, he was very old.
Yeah, he didn't actually make a lot of runs. In I think his high score was 45. He still averages 38 though, right? Like, so it's not like he drops off. He plays 4 tests in Sri Lanka and he averages 48. That includes when he played Sri Lanka was when that famous test where he plays against Murali for the first time. It comes down to Ian Healy and goes, I can't pick this leg spinner at all. And Healy goes, yeah, he's an offie, mate. Second time I've told that story in 24 hours, by the way, but I love that story. You know, in England, we obviously know that England wasn't a great side when he was playing against them. But he does play 25 tests in England and he averages 65. Like he averages 53 in the West Indies. He averages 54 in Asia. And then of course, a 65 in England. So when we were going through our book and I had a young guy working with me called Cheyenne, he's just going, how high can we get Bradman? So how high can we get Border? All the time, how much higher can we push Border up? Because you look at it and you're like, this guy was on an incredible level. And, you know, in my list of top 50 batters, he's on the same level as Greg Chappell and as Ricky Ponting, right?
Yeah.
But that is not how he's talked about in Australian cricket, other than the West Indies stuff, which we do hype up. And I think the biggest issue is that Allan Border is known as a captain, not as a batter. And people have forgotten just how good he was with the bat in his hand.
Yeah, that's probably right. Yeah, he's I primarily, because Border was the captain for pretty much since I can remember first watching cricket until whenever he gave it up, 93 or whatever. So that's basically my entire childhood and early cricket watching. And I remember how it was completely discombobulating when he disappeared. It's just like, wait a sec, who the hell is this fat bloody slip captaining the team? I don't want him. Where's AB? Give me my AB back. But yeah, so he became such a, like, he was just always there. You couldn't imagine anybody else captaining Australia for a long time. And there's no wonder he's kind of entrenched in everyone's mind as a captain rather than a player, because that's all he was for so long.
I've got this question for you. You might even talk about it in the book, but I'd be very interested. Where do you think Australian cricket goes if Border, I don't know, what other sport could Border have played? Hockey. I know he's left-handed. He can't be hockey, can he? They're banned.
Baseball. I remember hearing 1,000 times that he had a great baseball career ahead of him.
You're right. He was baseball, wasn't he? Let's say he got picked up for the major leagues and him and Dave Nielsen are off playing for the Brewers and other teams of names which I've forgotten at the moment. What do you think happens to Australian cricket? Because I think professionalism was coming anyway. Bob Simpson was obviously a huge part in changing the way that Australians prepared for cricket. There was the whole Institute of Sport thing. But I wonder if you just take the Border bit out, what do you think happens with cricket at that point?
God, so the mid 80s, you took, like, who's captain for starters? Like, when Hughes resigns, Hughes is still going to resign. Sorry,
Boone.
Mate, Boone was still
He was young, wasn't he?
At that point. Yeah,
yeah.
It's really hard to think of.
Like
might have been a bowler. I don't know.
But the bowlers didn't play. Jeff Lawson might have captained.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, Lawson was captain in New South Wales a lot, so maybe they just say, "All right, Lawson, you're it." Maybe, yeah. But either way, I think
Greg Ritchie.
Sorry,
Greg Ritchie.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, backcat and friends. So yeah, they could have been even worse in the 80s, which seems impossible to think of. You can't imagine them winning the 87 World Cup without Border there captaining them, because I don't think Simpson would come in straight away, because I think Border just said, I don't want to be in charge of any of this, or any of this, menial tasks. So that's when Simpson came in. Whether another captain would have handed it over that quickly or would have struggled on, or whether they would have just turned over captains, once a year, because they all got thrashed by the West Indies, who came out every single summer, as far as I can recall. Maybe that's what would have happened. It would have just been a turnover of captains, and maybe, like, all the professionalism and coaches and stuff just gets pushed back to the early 90s. I mean, maybe you don't get a Warren or maybe you don't get all these youngsters. Maybe they all get burnt out. And
that is why Nasser Hussain decided to bowl first at the Gabba. And this all, of course, reminds me of Hit Wicket, which is a mobile cricket strategy game that is all about making those tough decisions. Who do you want to send in as an opener when the asking rate is climbing? Do you go for the big hitter or the steady accumulator? Me, I like to throw in someone a little bit unorthodox. A bit of a wild card like the general. That keeps the opposition guessing. And what about the bowling attack? Do you unleash your express pace early or hold back for the death overs? I'm always tempted to bring on a mystery spinner in the middle overs and just try and break a partnership. Hit Wicket puts you in the captain's chair. You draft the squad and select the batting order and even decide when to use those game-changing abilities. Do you burn your 2 times ability to chase down a big total or save it for a critical moment later on? It's strategic, it's addictive, and it's more nerve-wracking than facing a show-up actor bouncer. Give it a go. Download Hit Wicket and see if you've got the tactical nous to win. Well, that's what I was thinking of. Like, what Border really does is he protects that whole generation of players from, outside of perhaps Dean Jones, who he couldn't, obviously there were personality issues between the team and Dean Jones and everything else, but he kind of protects Steve Waugh, who didn't make any runs forever, right? He, as you said, like I think Mark Taylor might have been better for Warne tactically, but I think you needed someone quite strong around Warne early on to, keep him there. The whole Glenn McGrath thing. Do you remember this? When Glenn McGrath was picked, everyone said, well, he'll never be successful because he doesn't have an outswinger, right?
Yeah.
And
then he tried to bowl an outswinger.
Yeah, that he did try by. And then, but Border was quite strong on, no, he does what he does. And obviously McGrath said a similar thing after he tried to bowl the outswinger for a little while and it was terrible. So that's a few, what would the Australian team have been like? I mean, I think if Border doesn't come in, this is going well into down the wormhole here, but there's a very big chance that there's a huge power issue between Mark Taylor and Dean Jones. Because Dean Jones, I think, plays if Border's not there, because he would have slotted back into the middle order spot where Border was taking up that spot. And Dean Jones was not the greatest leader, I could say, as a Victoria cricket fan. And I think Mark Taylor would have struggled to deal with Dean Jones consistently in that point. So it would have been, and if you go back and, Dino's no longer here to defend himself, but if you talk to any Victorian cricketer from the 90s, like that, the atmosphere of Victorian cricket was terrible, was absolutely terrible. And that, I think that would have bled over into the Australian team because you would have had Warne, you would have had Merv, you would have maybe even Paul Rifle, but the most important thing would have been Dino, and he would have been trying to, So I think there's a whole alternate history of what could have happened in that period, and maybe in the end it doesn't matter. That maybe once Warner McGrath gets so good and Mark Taylor wins a bunch of tests, and maybe he just gets the captaincy earlier, as you were saying before, because Mark Taylor, I reckon he was delayed about 2 years coming into the side. Do you remember Wayne Phillips?
There were quite a few opening options. I mean, they had Boone and Marsh for a while, and then they were trying to work out how to squeeze everybody in there. But and that's that's why Dean Jones went. So if Border isn't there, then Dean Jones doesn't have to go. Like they can't afford to drop him at that point. He scores too many runs to be dropped in a weaker team. So it's a good thought experiment. Good Doctor Strange work.
Yeah. No, it's just something I was coming up with all the way through. What else do you sort of have about what other sort of thoughts did you have about Allan Border, and was there anything else that sort of spoke to you that maybe before you did the book you hadn't really come to your mind?
It's not really so much about Border. I was kind of intrigued. I knew that Warne hadn't won an Allan Border Medal, and he is, spoiler, he's the player of the 90s, which is useful because that meant I get to write about him as well. But I think the research I did suggests that Warne was a big factor in kind of creating this thing, and he loved Border, so he was like a massive proponent, and maybe he's a big point behind it, the actual naming of it. I wasn't able to determine why it was named after Border, but the fact that Warne was just like, no, we should have this celebration. And Warne was never short of an ego either. So I'm sure it was just like, hey, we should be up on stage getting all these plaudits and awards. Look how good we are. Come on, tell us about it.
What were some of were there any other cricketers that through, your research that, especially you said before, you're not a historian in that kind of way. What were some of the cricketers, whether from modern times or from older times, that sort of you didn't know much about and this sort of changed your opinion of?
I think the 60s were an interesting era. Because the 60s ended up being, it was bad luck for Richie Benaud that he kind of straddled the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s, which meant he didn't actually qualify to win either one of them. So it ended up being Bill Lawry who actually won the 60s. So I wasn't quite aware of how dominant Bill Lawry was at his peak. You think of him as a commentator these days. It's just like, Bill Lawry's that very excitable man who loves Victorians. But no, he was a bloody good cricketer as well. So I knew he was good. I didn't quite realise how good he was. So that was interesting.
Well, it was funny when I talked to Ian Chappell for the book. He was sort of saying that a part of the reason that Bill Lawry has been talked down is the way that because of his relationship with Tony Gregg.
Right.
So the whole corpse with pads on and defensive and everything, and you go through Bill Lawry's record. And he was a defensive batter, but I don't think he was like defensive for his era, if that makes sense. When we're not talking about one of those batters who had a strike rate of 28 or 29. And in fact, he was quite a good scorer. And what Ian Chappell said was he was brilliant to bat with because he was always looking for singles. So you were never off strike very long with Bill Lawry. So he wasn't like a boycott who was, I'm going to defend, I'm going to defend, I'm going to defend. Now there's a ball I can score off.
Yeah.
Bill was constantly looking for runs. I do think, if I'm not mistaken, Bill Lawry is one of those Australian cricketers who averaged 56 at home and 39 away from home.
Yeah.
So he's exactly the sort of guy I was talking about before with one of those, with the anti-border. But I really, again, when I was, it's funny because our books sort of overlap because we're both doing a similar thing, except I'm looking at other cricketers. But it is another interesting one of, when I looked at it, Bob Simpson and Bill Lawry, Bob Simpson has a much better batting average overall. Yep. But when you start to break down everything, it's like no one considered Bob Simpson the better player. And he made some runs, some huge scores, like the 100 on a very flat wicket and everything else. Whereas Bill Lawry was considered the better player, but he has a bit of a drop-off at the end of his career because the captaincy completely erodes his mind.
Yeah.
And so, again, all those things matter to your legacy. Was there any other sort of older players that's a really good one, Bill Lawry, because people just don't remember him as a great bat, and he clearly was.
Yeah. Not so much an older one. One of the things I found kind of quirky about, like, in the actual era of the Allan Border Medal was how David Warner won as many as he did, but and it's kind of a quirk of the mechanism of how it works. So it's 3-2-1 for the best players, but that meant he won in a year where Australia he basically won the 2020 award for performances in 2019, despite being absolutely rubbish during the 2019 Ashes, because you don't get points taken off you for being terrible. You just get points when you're really good. So as good as Steve Smith was that summer, David Warner was just as good in the World Cup that year, and good enough in the Australian summer that followed, that all his rubbishness during the Ashes in 2019 didn't count. That didn't take any points off. And sorry, Steve Smith. So there's a lot of times where you look at it and you go, surely Steve Smith, who's averaged 90, 80, some ridiculous number in Test cricket, surely he wins. No, it's David Warner who's averaged some lower amount but has had these incredible peaks to go alongside these equally incredible troughs.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because I never thought about it. Because of the sort of Brownlow-Dally M style of voting system, that it doesn't really look for the player who is the best player. It's a little bit more slanted towards were you a really good player consistently over a long period of time, rather than let's say. I don't know. Let's say Fraser McGurk this year makes two double hundreds in ODI cricket, and a couple of 150s in T20 cricket, and then makes his Test debut and makes 100. He's not more likely to win it than Josh Hazlewood is for regularly taking 2, 3, and 4 wicket hauls.
As long as Josh Hazlewood is getting 2 and 1 points, he's fine. But if Josh Hazlewood is like the 4th or 5th best, then he's in trouble. So it's really interesting. You've got to be in the top 3 every game for that to apply. Or you
But
can
you know
do
what I
Warren
mean? Because you can get a bunch of 3 votes, right,
Yes.
for being very good. But it's not like, so let's say, okay, let's take it a step further. Let's say Fraser McGoodman did 100 in an ODI game for Australia, right? He still only
Wouldn't put it
gets
past
3
him.
votes. Yeah, he still only gets 3 votes, whereas Aaron Hardy takes 4
Yes.
for,
Yeah.
and 2 of those wickets are in at the tail, and he might get 3 votes in a loss. So
Yes.
I'd never really, until you said it, but it's because I was brought up to believe that this is the greatest system of all time because of Aussie rules football, and only now am I looking at it going, wait a minute, that's not how the other major awards in other sports work, right? Like if you were to put together, so Mitchell Johnson, I'm assuming in 2013-14 did pretty well because of what happened, but if all of his performances were in those games, and then outside of those games, he was just an ordinary cricketer who didn't pick up any votes, someone else could steal that award from him. So is David Warner the best case? Has there been another one where someone else has kind of done that as well?
I think Warner was the one that really stood out to me as like, wait a sec, Smith was so good this year. How can it not be Smith? And it's just like, no, it's Warner. And it's just kind of, and because I went back and I looked at all the newspaper articles at the time, it's just like, all the newspaper articles are furious. It's like, Stuart Broad is doing, congratulations, David Warner, lol tweets. David Warner is the clearest example of that one. There was also an example in the very early days. Colin Miller was the Test Player of the Year on countback alongside, everybody got 2 points. Everybody got 2 threes or 3 twos throughout the summer or the year. And it ended up, 4 or 5 of them all tied. And then there was a convoluted countback system. And Colin Miller's the best Test player amongst this team of champions. Why not? Let's go with that.
He wasn't even always in the side, was he? I mean, that was really early on in the Allan Border, night and everything. And we're all like, wait, what? I mean, I think it's great that a role player can come through and do something like that. But it was a pretty strong team, Dad. Like, I think I kind of feel that someone else could have done it. Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. How would you change the voting because I was thinking then that the other way of doing this is you give 10 votes per game, and then one player can get 8, and another one can get 2. But you can also have situations where you might also say, no, we're not giving out the full votes for this game. We got bowled out for 48 in an ODI, and they beat it. Like, it's like one person gets 1 vote for making 12.
Maybe just going with what you're saying there. If you win, you get 30 points to divvy up. If you draw or tie or no result, you get 20 points to divvy up. If you lose, you get 10 points to divvy up. And maybe that's how you do it. Just for comical purposes, I would love to have the players voting on -3, -2, and -1 for their 3 worst teammates in every match. That would make me very happy, especially if they put up on the board who got the votes. That would be perfect.
Would you change who does the voting?
I think it's fine to have teammates vote on it. So it's teammates and then press and umpires. It's a bit hazy exactly how it's all combined together. I did try to research this. It's all incredibly vague. It mostly seems to give pretty decent results. I'm fine with it. Whatever.
because we mentioned
Twitter
the Brownlow
vote
before. Yeah,
Blue Sky vote.
Because we mentioned the Brownlow before. There's been some incredible moments in the Brownlow in Aussie rules football when weird things have happened. There was a player called Shane Woden who won the Brownlow it must have been late 90s, early 2000s, around the time the Allan Border was probably coming about. And he had bleached blonde hair, and there was a theory that if you had a really, really full on hair style, the umpires would notice you more because it would stick out. And on top of that, I think he and another player might have both had bleached blonde hair, and the thought process was that the umpires had kind of just combined them into one player. And the guy who was down with the guy who was down on the ground doing all the naughty work, you couldn't see his face because his head was down, but the blonde hair was there. And then the other guy was quite stylish out on the wings, kicking the ball beautifully down the field. It's my point B is it's not a perfect system, but as someone who follows the NBA and watches some of the voting, there was a guy a couple of years ago who did his NBA voting and just forgot a player.
Yeah.
Right. And it was like a major commentator. It wasn't like some beat reporter from Phoenix or something, right? It was like, and like afterwards, everyone had to say to him, you didn't put this player on. He goes, no, he's there. And they're like, no, he's not. You didn't give him a vote. So there is no perfect system. But
No.
I'm with you. I think there's something very Australian cricket about the fact that the players have the biggest vote. Because
Yes.
that's kind of what why I've always thought what distinguishes Australian cricket is we probably look more at what you've done for the team rather than what your individual stats are. So there's an element of that. At the end of this book, did you love the Allan Border Medal more? Do you never want to watch another Allan Border Medal? Where are you with this emotionally?
I think my policy on watching the actual ceremony itself will continue to be the same. It's just like, well, I'll wait for clips to come out on whatever social media platform I happen to be on, and maybe I'll click through on any that get enough retweets that suggest that it's amusing. Otherwise, I'll just read who won. The actual award itself, it's fine. More often than not, it goes to the right person. So I'm happy with that. And I haven't really mentioned yet that obviously I'm writing about the women as well. So there's lots of the Belinda Clarke award.
You talked about Betty Wilson before, and you talked about Belinda Clarke. So how many Belinda Clarkes would Belinda Clarke have won if Belinda Clarke could Belinda Clarke?
She would have won not as many as you thought, because Karen Rolton kept hogging all the stuff in that kind of era, and Karen Rolton actually went on to win. I think it was the first 4 Belinda Clarke awards. Like, she was an unstoppable creature around the turn of the century there. And then of course you get into the I kind of like the symmetry of it begins with this great men's team of the turn of the century, a great men's Australian team, and then there's kind of this lull, and then all of a sudden this great kind of women's Australian team emerges, and that kind of drives because there is no mention of women at all for like the first decade or so of coverage. Like, technically they're winning medals, no one cares about it, like no one mentions it, and then slowly but surely it's really fascinating to go through the old newspaper articles, just like, oh, someone's talking about more than just one. Oh, didn't whoever Elise Perry looked lovely in that gown last night? It's just like, no. They start talking about the cricket, and then it's more and more, and then you get to today where it's pretty much as close as equal as you can get.
Yeah, I mean, that's really fascinating because I was in Australia. I think of the Allan Border night, the whole thing as a men's event, because I moved to the UK in 2008. And at that stage, there was a junior award and there was a women's award, but it was very much like, best special effects makeup at the Oscars, wasn't it? It was almost over the road, pre-recorded beforehand type of thing. And so I don't even think of it. I mean, I don't think of the Allan Border Medal very much. I've thought more about the Allan Border Medal today than I have probably for the last decade and a half combined, right? Like, it just... apologies to Cricket Australia, who's still trying to make it a thing, but it hasn't worked for me, and being away from it and not having it just pop up on the TV. But it is really interesting that it has become something else, and I suppose having a star specifically like Elise Perry, and then the entire team that follows her as well. Yeah. It would be silly now if it was, if you, as you said, in the Shane, but by the time we got to the Shane Watson years and the women's team is becoming the best team in the world, it would be kind of ridiculous to be going on about Shane Watson while Elise Perry is sitting beside him. Yeah.
And it starts to pick up around that stage. And I think it really kicks into gear when, in the Sandpaper Gate year, where it's just like, oh God, everyone hates these men. Bloody hell, those women are looking pretty good, aren't they? Don't they win everything? Let's pay more attention to them. That may be too cynical, but that's certainly the vibe I got from. Oh, let's really bump up the profile on this now.
Yep. How far back did you go with the women? Like,
I went all the way back to the
1930s.
Yep. When very, very little data. So there are women winning based on a single test in a single year. It's just like, fine, you get it. You're the best player.
Who won in the 1980s? Do you remember?
1980s. Oh God, I can't tell you off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
No, because there's a really controversial Australian women's player called, I think her name is it Denise Annetts?
Yes. Yep. I recognize that name. Yes.
Yeah, so she averages in Test cricket. So I'm just trying to bring it up now because it's a ridiculous amount when I tell you. She averaged 81.9 and was dropped from the Australian team and then claimed that she was dropped because she was straight and not gay.
That's
and
right. Yeah, I remember that.
And I wondered if you had to give her the Belinda Clarke medal because that, of course, you did?
Yeah, she's definitely in the table in there. I remember that name. I recognize that name. She's in there.
There we go.
I didn't write a full piece on her, but she's in there. She's in a table in the book.
She's in my book as well. There really isn't a lot of information about her, and most of the information is about the allegation.
Yeah.
Women's cricket, just as you said before, you said there was no stats. There's very little coverage of the games as well. Like there's, in because I think in England there's so many newspapers. There's little agency copies that you can go through, and Hypercourse is more of an expert than you and I are on those sorts of things. But when you go to women's cricket and you try and go back and look at the old players, sometimes you don't get anything at all on any of these players, and you don't know much. And so she's, as I said, someone who plays 10 test matches, which for women's cricket is not, modern women's cricket is not a small amount. But even in the history of, I think the most is probably 25 to 35, right? Like there's a few players around that period. So she played a decent amount, but there isn't a lot on her as a player. But there is a lot on her and this controversy.
Yeah. It was very fascinating. I specifically had a section in my book where I tracked each year like how much coverage there was of the women's cricket and how it was changing over time. And that was one of the more, because I'm no saint. I was as oblivious about women's cricket as most men, I think, when the Allan Border Medal started. And
but also when we were watching cricket, it wasn't on TV and it wasn't on radio, and the newspapers wouldn't cover it. So if you think of the Australian women's cricket, we had the World Cup win in the 90s was quite big when they won at Eden Gardens. I remember that getting a lot of press. Zoe Goss getting Brian Lara out in the cricket game. Belinda Clarke and Karen Rolton being stars was mentioned. Like you would hear that. And Catherine Fitzpatrick was a big deal because she was the fastest woman in the world. And I remember her. I don't know the guy's name, but he works with Tony Martin, Ed something, the comedian. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I could be wrong with this. You might be able to write a whole essay on this one time. I'm pretty sure he faced Catherine Fitzpatrick because he could play cricket. I think he's the comedian who did, and Catherine Fitzpatrick bounced him, and he suddenly realized, oh shit, no, she's legit. This is not what I was expecting to face. And I think it was him. Yeah, and it was a really interesting one because that was right at the start of that period. So when do you notice the media start to cover it in Australia, women's cricket, compared to before?
It's really in that, that 2013-14 era. Like it's basically when, your Healy's, your Lannings, your Perrys are all just like, all right, here we go. We're not going to be stopped anymore. And it's just like, okay, fine. We'll pay attention to you.
I remember, and it must be just before that, when Rebel Sport did a whole thing, and I forget the woman's name, I'm really sorry, but Michael Clarke's wife, is it Kylie Clarke?
Kylie, yeah.
Yeah. I remember
Kylie
there was a huge...
Clarke.
Yeah, they did a huge thing. Yeah, let's hope that she hasn't changed today. I remember her next to the white horse, her on the white horse, with Michael Clarke. Like, I remember some details about Kylie Clarke, so, got to give me some credits there. If her name is Kylie, and it's not somebody else. But...
I think it's Kyly as well.
It is. I don't know if you could see it. It was in my eyes, but I didn't want to get into that because I think I read about 10 columns on the spelling. But she got a deal with Rebel Sport, I want to say, around that whole 2012 to 2014-15 period. I can't remember exactly when it was. And I remember for the first time, a lot of people going, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Like, she's got a deal with Rebel Sport to, be the face of their, fitness stuff. And Elise Perry doesn't have a deal with anyone. And that's the period when I remember it. And, I'd already moved over to Australia, to England by that stage. So I'd moved out of it. But that's the period that I remember the coverage of it all changing and everything else. So, and as you said before, that 2013-2014 period, it's when the team becomes professional as well. It's very hard to cover an amateur team, that is sporadically touring, that is quite often going to other countries where no one is covering their matches as well. Like I understand that there was certainly a huge amount of misogyny and ignorance and everything else. But even if you love women's cricket, it was not particularly easy to follow in the 90s.
Yeah.
Like I was helping coaching women's cricket in the 90s, and I was interested in those players. And unless Belinda Clarke made 200 in an ODI game, I probably wasn't going to be hearing anything about it.
Yeah. It's a completely different era. I found it fascinating how close it is, and yet how alien it is to the modern coverage. It's fascinating.
We said that the Allan Border one was an interesting name. How are you about the Belinda Clarke? Because again, star player, but more famous for really what she represents as much as anything else.
Yeah, I think she's slightly different to Allan Border. I think she's the one kind of pioneering the professionalism, like not actual professionalism in terms of money, but professionalism in terms of mindset in the 90s. So I think that's kind of her legacy. What would have happened if she wasn't there? God only knows. Maybe Karen Rolton steps up and says, "I'm just as professional as you." Maybe nothing changes that much. It is interesting to think about.
Yeah, because it's funny that those are the two cricketers we've picked, and they are both hugely important on the future of cricket. But like, I don't think Belinda Clarke in 10 or 15 years' time will be talking about her as a batter or a leader as much because she's already sort of slipping. Yeah, and yet in some ways Belinda Clarke's maybe even more important than someone like Allan Border because she's the person who sort of crosses over between men's and women's cricket in that she ends up, being very important to the men's team as well and to all the cricketers. Your book is called Australian Cricket's Best of the Best, the outrageous unofficial, and then I forgot to ask you the rest of the title. Put it up on the screen.
Outrageous
Have you got it in front of
unofficial
you?
History of the Allan Border Medal. You will be outraged. Outraged. That's what it is. Smiling Pat Cummins on the cover.
How many Allan Border medals has he won?
Pat's won a single Allan Border Medal. He sensibly did it in the year when Warner and Smith were both out. So it's like, all right, I'll jump in here and take that one, thanks.
Feels like you've just put him on as some sort of woke agenda for your book, rather than him being. I would have liked it if you just put Pat Cummins' body, and just stuck Allan Border's face over the front of it.
I'll let my
grumpy
publishers
face.
know. Yeah.
Yeah, for the reprint. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Jared.